All right. Well, welcome everyone. So I'm glad to see everyone back this week. So really enjoyed having you all in this presentation last week there when we went over the history of epidemics. We talked about some of the factors that were leading up to the Black Death, some of the things that were going into making this one of the most catastrophic pandemics in all of history, if not the most deadly and catastrophic pandemic here. So today we are going to be getting into some of the other factors that are leading up to the plague, and we'll be getting into the spread of the plague itself and some of the responses to it. Basically, what did medieval people think was going on? What did they think caused this? And who did they blame for it? And how did they react? So we're going to be getting into all of that today. So I want to pick up where we left off in the last class. We had been talking a little bit about hygiene in the Middle Ages and how it was not the best situation for most people living in Western medieval Europe at this time. So basically, their environment was filthy. The people themselves were a little bit cleaner than you might expect, but the environment was absolutely filthy and ripe for plague. And so now I want to get into the situation with, well, war in the 14th century, because that plays a major role in the plague as well. So in the previous class, we had talked about the four horsemen of the apocalypse and how we often see this war, famine, plague sort of phenomenon play out, that all of them are related to one another. And so, so I want to focus on what changes in the 14th century to cause war to become more of a problem here. And so, we think about this, basically war drives the farmer from his fields and destroys his crops. The destruction of crops leads to famine, and starved and weakened people are easy victims of the plague. And so we see this war, famine, plague pattern happening over and over and over again throughout history. And in the 14th century, it's no exception, though you could argue that the war was on a grander scale than what we had seen throughout the rest of the early Middle Ages. And the famine was more devastating, and the plague was not about to be upstaged by the other two. And so to give a little bit of background on the state of warfare leading up to the 14th century.
Stephanie, can I interrupt for just
sure.
a second? We've had some requests if you could take it off presenter mode and maximize your slide.
So, oh, let's see. So this is not, oh, okay. Let's see. All right, let me go that. Oh, I didn't even realize that it was doing that because it was up on my other screen there. All right, well, let me fix that then. Just a minute. We'll move this back over here and get this started then. So let me pull this up. Turn this off and fix my technical difficulties there. So, all right, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and so to give a little bit of background information there on warfare leading up to the 14th century, if we look at warfare in the early Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages in Europe, and even into some of the High Middle Ages, so roughly the period between 500 and about 1300 AD, war had not been nearly as deadly or devastating as it had been at the height of the Roman Empire. And if we look back to Rome, we see 75,000 soldiers dying in a single battle at the Battle of Cannae with the Carthaginians, 75,000 soldiers. And we don't see anything like that throughout most of the Middle Ages. And this is because of a lack of a well-funded, centralized government. Okay, so simply put, Rome had that many soldiers to lose, and which is evidence of how large the Roman Empire was, how powerful it was, how well funded it was. Throughout the Middle Ages, a feudal lord is lucky if they can get together maybe a couple hundred knights. And if you see battles that include a few thousand knights, that's something that's remarkable. And so, so we see the scale of warfare kind of shifting downward throughout most of the early Middle Ages. But this all starts to change around the 14th century. So we start to see strong centralized governments, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire, France, and England. And so they're now able to get thousands and thousands of soldiers together for just a single battle, sometimes tens of thousands of soldiers together. And that's exactly what France and England do during the 100 Years' War. And so the 100 Years' War, spanning roughly 1337 to about 1353. And during this time, we see massive casualties, not only because the armies are just larger than they had been in previous centuries, but they're also equipped with much more devastating weapons, namely the longbow and gunpowder as well. And so they also switch from these cavalry-based assaults to more infantry and archery-based ones, which also increases the number of casualties. And on top of all of these battle-related casualties, soldiers during the 100 Years' War were known for just murdering peasants with reckless abandon. And so contemporaries at the time believed that war absolutely led to plagues. Okay, so war absolutely leads to plagues. And we have countless sources saying that after a battle, both the bodies of men and horses would litter the fields and remain unburied. And then their stench would form this gaseous sort of substance on top of the field, a substance called miasma. And this cloud of miasma that wafted up from the battlefield would then waft over towns and cities and start making people sick. And so they also believed that war forced people to adopt bad diets, because in desperate times you'll eat whatever you can get a hold of there. And so people are eating things they perhaps shouldn't be eating, or perhaps they don't have enough to eat. So they have a bad diet, which throws your humors into disarray, according to contemporaries. And they thought that that made you more susceptible to plague. And they also believed that when people experienced heightened levels of fear and anxiety for prolonged periods of time, that it caused putrefaction of your humors, and that you are much more likely to become ill after that. And this is kind of interesting because even though their theory about the four humors isn't exactly scientifically sound, they are absolutely correct that eating a poor diet and experiencing high levels of stress affect your immune system. And this definitely does leave you more vulnerable to illness. And this is all compounded by the fact that these wars create refugee populations. And so these refugees often travel in large crowds from one town to the next, seeking shelter and security. And they often bring their animals with them as well. So you might end up with 3 or 4 families hunkering down in a teeny tiny cottage with all of their animals, or dozens of families hunkering down in a monastery or a church, just trying to get away from the violence. So we have lots of people who are not eating well, who are stressed out, who are in huge crowds. What could possibly go wrong here? And so in the slide there, you can actually see a quote from Petrarch, who is remarking on the state of the Hundred Years' War, that when he goes through the French countryside, all he sees is devastation, just the scars of defeat, as he says here. And that's only the beginning. So what's going to happen next is going to be much, much worse. And so since we've talked a little bit about this issue with war in the 14th century, I want to talk about the famine that people experience in the 14th century and what causes it, why it's so bad, how many people might have died during this famine. So, So Europe experiences a period from about the year 1000 or so until about 1315 called the Little Optimum. And it's when the temperature just goes up. So it's global warming essentially, but it's a good thing. And so the temperature goes up. We see agricultural productivity just going through the roof during this time. As the name Little Optimum would imply, it's a good time. All right. People are just living their best lives during this period. However, the Little Optimum comes to an end in 1315, and the temperature drops. Not only does the temperature drop, but we start to see increased levels of precipitation. So it's constantly raining and it's cold. Even in the middle of summer, they experience constant rain, and their summers would be more like our falls, okay, or spring. So instead of being 80 or 90 degrees in the middle of the summer, it might be 50 degrees in the middle of the summer and pouring down rain, which means that it's going to affect their crop yields. And not only is it affecting the way that their crops are growing, but they have a huge problem storing their crops because they can't dry anything out. So it is making it so that you can't dry out the hay for the animals. You can't dry out any of your wheat that you're trying to store in the silos. And when you get meats, for example, you can't really dry those out or smoke them because everything just starts to go bad. And so this becomes a huge problem all across Europe and even into Eastern Europe and some parts of the Persian Empire as well. And so people are forced to do things like eat their seed stock. Okay, so they start eating their seed stock because it's all they have, but then that perpetuates the situation because they have nothing to use to grow crops the next year. And they're not only eating their seeds, but they're eating all of their animals that they have that they typically might have relied on for milk or eggs or what have you. They just start getting desperate and eating everything in sight, which again cripples them even further going into the future. And they're getting sick off of what they're eating because, as I mentioned with the situation with the 100 Years' War, desperate times call for desperate measures. You will eat whatever you can find to eat if you're starving. And so they're eating a lot of spoiled food. And when I say spoiled food, I mean specifically they're eating food that is contaminated with ergotism, or ergot rather. So we talked a little bit about this in the previous presentation when we were discussing the plague of Cyprian in ancient Rome, and how there are some epidemiologists who believe that it might have been a very, very virulent strain of ergot. And in this case, with the Great Famine, we know for a fact that people were eating contaminated rye and other grains that had ergot. And so when they consume this ergot, it causes that phenomenon where you feel like you're on fire and you start hallucinating. You can potentially die from ergot. But one of the biggest problems that they experienced was being killed by someone else as a result. Because if you're living in the Middle Ages, and all of a sudden you start hallucinating and telling people that you're on fire, you're seeing things. I mean, people are going to automatically assume that you are possessed by demons and that perhaps you need to be killed as a result. And so a lot of people end up dying just because of all of the hallucinations and things like that associated with ergotism. And so not only are they coming down with ergotism, eating spoiled foods, and just generally having a tough time in the food department there, but crime goes up because of course it does. So if people are starving, they will do anything for food, and they'll do anything to defend what little food they might have. And so we see the murder rate going up at this time. And chivalry just kind of goes out the window. It's every man for himself when it comes to getting food. Although we do see some instances of selfless acts during this period. There are some instances of older people voluntarily not eating so that younger people and their families can survive. And so some people are taking one for the team there to try to help their children survive here. But for the most part, we see a total breakdown in society here. And we see an uptick in persecution as a result of this. People desperately want an explanation for it. They want someone to blame for all of this. And so they blame the folks that you're seeing in the picture in the top left there. What you're looking at right there are witches. So interestingly enough, throughout most of the Middle Ages, witches were not persecuted. Okay, and I know that when we think about the Middle Ages, we automatically think of them persecuting witches right and left. But in actuality, it was considered heresy to even believe in witchcraft. You could be persecuted for saying that someone was a witch or was practicing witchcraft. So we don't really see much systemic persecution of witches throughout most of the Middle Ages. But this all comes to an end in the 14th century because of the Great Famine. It was largely believed, mostly bottom up, as in from everyday average Joe sort of citizens there, that witches were causing it, that they were conjuring and causing it to rain, causing it to get cold. And so if they want to do something about this situation, well, they need to round these witches up. And eventually, even the church gets on board and they decide that it's no longer heresy to believe in witchcraft. And then later on, we have a pope who decides that yeah, you should bring witches into the Inquisition and torture them as much as you want, potentially execute them, because we have to do something about this situation here. So we're seeing crime go up, we're seeing people starving to death, we're seeing persecution go up, and one of you had mentioned in the chat there that that ergotism was something that was present in Salem during the witch trials. And yeah, that's true, that they believe that the girls had actually been infected with ergot, and that they started hallucinating all of those wild tales about witches. So ergotism has been quite a pain as far as witches in particular are concerned. Many a person has died because of that silly little fungus there. And so having said all of that, ultimately, the Great Famine ends up killing about 25% of the European population. So 25% of the European population. That's huge. So we're talking about millions upon millions upon millions of people dying throughout this famine. And so it's kind of interesting to me that when I teach this in my classes at school, that most of my students have only ever heard of maybe the Irish potato famine that happened in the 19th century, but nobody ever hears about the medieval famine here, which killed significantly more people. And so we have millions of people dying from the famine. We have tons and tons of people dying as a result of the 100 Years' War. And so all of these things are paving the way for for the plague to be, of course, one of the most catastrophic events in all of human history. And so now I want to talk about something that made it catastrophic on a global scale, because as a medieval historian and someone who kind of specializes in the plague, one of my biggest pet peeves is when the Black Death is framed as a European phenomenon. Okay, which I'm sure that many of us have seen this before. I saw it myself in my high school textbooks, that they would say 1/3 of all Europeans died in the Black Death. And that makes it seem as though it only hit Europe and only affected Europe. And we're going to see very soon that that is not the case, not even a little bit. And so, oh, and I had a question about approximately how many people existed in Europe before the Great Famine. So it's really difficult to say exactly how many people were in Europe at the time, because of record keeping and the fact that that they often didn't keep records for peasants. So most of the poorer people in the population there weren't even counted. But we could probably estimate it somewhere or another between about 30 million or so to possibly upwards from there, but I'd say 30 million is a decent estimate for this time. So having said all of that, I want to talk about what causes this to be or take place on a global scale. What helps to facilitate the spread of the plague? So I want to give a little bit of background information on the Silk Road. So you've probably heard of the Silk Road before. Think of it as this trade network going from China throughout the Middle East and into the Mediterranean there. And we start to see the scope or scale of the Silk Road being expanded during the 13th and 14th centuries. And so I want to give a little bit of background on this to get an idea of when these trade networks were established and why, and how large it was by the time that we get up to the Black Death. So the Silk Road had been around since the Han Dynasty in China, going all the way back to about the 3rd century BCE. And at least at that time, we think it was primarily an intra-Chinese trade network. But then it began to expand outside of China starting around the 2nd century BCE. But there are a number of historians who think that it's actually much older than that, especially because we find evidence of Chinese silk in Egyptian tombs that are going all the way back to about the 11th century BCE. So that might be a little bit of an outlier there, but we have definitive proof and documentation going all the way back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries BCE. And so we hear even from the ancient Greeks, we hear from Herodotus that there's a Persian royal road that stretches throughout the Persian Empire and has riders in each oasis where they can very quickly relay goods and messages. So a trip that would typically take someone about 3 months takes these travelers only about 9 days. And so we hear about this from the Greeks there. We definitely hear about connections between China, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, starting with Alexander the Great as well. And so, so we have connections going all the way back to antiquity here. And then we later hear, even from Chinese sources, that the Chinese emperor valued the heavenly horses of the great Ionians. And what I mean by that is that the horses that were being bred by the Greeks who lived in the Middle East were tended to be a lot larger and sturdier than some of the horses that they were breeding in China at that time. So we know that China was also receiving goods from the West during this period. So it's completely interconnected at this time. And so later on, we start to hear about Romans crossing paths with the Chinese there. That as Romans were expanding into the Middle East, they come into contact with the Chinese who are policing the Silk Road there. In fact, Romans might have even adopted the crossbow from the Chinese when they come into contact with them on the Silk Road. And we even hear of Roman emperors meeting up with Chinese diplomats and traders along the way. Augustus, for example, had met up with Chinese emissaries who were traveling along the Silk Road there. And then a little bit later on, we hear of emperors like Marcus Aurelius traveling along the Silk Road, meeting up with them as well. So these connections here are very, very well established. And one of the reasons why Rome cares about this in the first place is because Roman aristocrats would practically bankrupt themselves trying to get a hold of Chinese silk. So silk was far and away the most lucrative good, of course, that was spread along the Silk Road in the ancient world. But it went both ways. So we know that the Chinese were really interested in Roman glassware. In fact, if you've, I don't know, gone to somewhere in Italy, even recently, you know that they're known for their blown glass. And so that goes all the way back to the Roman Empire. And so we have Rome and China trading along the Silk Road. And but after the decline of the Roman Empire, we start to see some of these connections kind of drying up, particularly connections into Western Europe. But in Eastern Europe, in the Byzantine Empire, there are still connections on the Silk Road. In fact, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian sent spies along the road to figure out how silk is made so that they can start making it in Byzantium. And these spies were apparently successful. So they managed to get eggs from the silkworms and then start cultivating them in Byzantium. Which I always wonder how surprised everyone in Europe was when they found out that this luxurious fabric that they had been paying top dollar for was made from worms. So that had to have come as a shock to everyone. But nonetheless, the Byzantines start to produce this, but surprisingly, this has no effect whatsoever on the Chinese market for silk, because going into the early to high Middle Ages, people who were really, really wealthy did not want Byzantine silk. Byzantine silk was knockoff silk, all right? You wanted the real deal. You want Chinese silk if you're gonna get silk, because it was seen as being higher quality and being more authentic than the Byzantine stuff. And so, throughout much of the early Middle Ages, we still see some trade throughout the Silk Road there, but beginning in the 13th century, we see a sort of trade explosion. All right. And this trade explosion along the Silk Road was largely because of Genghis Khan. So we see the rise of the Mongols in the 13th century, and the Mongol Empire would eventually become the largest contiguous empire in all of history. And in fact, the Mongols end up conquering more territory in 25 years than the Romans did in 400 years. And so there are two major reasons for that. One of them is that Genghis Khan tended to promote people based on merit instead of basing it on family ties, like many of his predecessors had done. And two, he tended to incorporate conquered peoples into his army, and he would dispossess wealthy overlords and then basically bring the poor people that they had been oppressing into his army. So poor people actually loved to see Genghis Khan coming, for the most part, if they were willing to capitulate and join up with him. If not, then it was too bad for them, because the Mongols would actually put quotas or give their soldiers quotas of how many people they needed to kill that day. So if you come in with an army of 10,000 and every single soldier has a quota of 24 people that they have to kill, you can see how the death toll due to the Mongols is going to be through the roof. And so, so we see the Mongol Empire expanding all throughout Central Asia, and then taking over the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East, taking over the Song Dynasty in China, and taking over Russia almost in its entirety. And so the Mongols end up expanding the Silk Road. So they expand it into Russia, all throughout not only Northern Asia, but into Northern Europe as well. And they expand the Silk Road to the far reaches of Western Europe as well, and throughout all of the Mediterranean into North Africa, and even some parts of sub-Saharan Africa as well. And when we think about this trade network, we shouldn't think of it as just being an overland trade network, because I know the word road implies that they are traveling on a road on land, but the Silk Road was also an overseas trade network that went all throughout the Indian Ocean and into the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and so on and so forth. And so the Mongols expand the Silk Road, completely expand its scope here. And but with all of the benefits of expanding the Silk Road come some major drawbacks. Okay, and so now, oh, and I had a question about Marco Polo traveling along the Silk Road at this time. So he was traveling along the Silk Road roughly in the 13th century. So yes, so that is definitely part of it, and he may very well have brought noodles to Italy. So brought them from China, and so I guess we have pasta in Italy there, thanks to Marco Polo going to China. And so let's see. So now I also had a question about 14th century Chinese borders and how they might compare to current borders here. And that is a question that would be best answered with a map that I don't have right now, but I might be able to dig that up and present it in the next lecture there. So now I want to talk about the beginnings of the plague. We have finally gotten to the plague itself. And so, as I said, as someone who studies the plague, I hate it when folks frame it as a European phenomenon here, because in actuality, the Black Death starts in China and kills millions upon millions upon millions of Asians before it even gets to Europe there. Not to mention the fact that this ends up spreading into Africa as well, so killing a number of Africans in addition to killing Europeans there. So I want to expand the idea of where the plague is taking place. And so, so when we're talking about the beginnings of the plague, one of the questions that really vexes me and many other people is, well, how does it start? How does a plague just manifest itself? Which is something, of course, we've had to ask ourselves in the last year. All right, where does it come from? How does it begin? How does it start spreading to different people? What happens here? And so this is what historians and epidemiologists have had to ask about the Black Death. So one of the foremost explanations for how the plague began was that the bacteria that causes the plague, Yersinia pestis, is a bacteria that is endemic to burrowing rodents, like the adorable little rodent that you're seeing in the picture above. What you're looking at there is a marmot. And if you're looking at that and thinking, oh, it looks kind of cute and fuzzy and chubby, and you kind of just want to pet it, maybe pick it up. It looks almost squishy. And so it's kind of cute. And that's exactly what people in the Middle Ages and even today still think here, which is why they would capture these and use them for their fur. So that fur there is incredibly thick and very, very warm. And so the marmots tended to hold on to plague bacteria. It was endemic to their population. And they helped to preserve that bacteria because when they would burrow underground in the winter, it allowed them to essentially keep that bacteria alive in really inhospitable hospitable conditions. So going as far north as Siberia. And so, so this bacteria is endemic to burrowing rodents. But that begs the question of how do we make that jump from rodents to people? And also, why is it that the plague just suddenly broke out in the 14th century? If it's endemic to these rodents, why hadn't it been spreading among the people before that? And the answer to that is that oftentimes the people who are living near these rodent populations and potentially hunting these marmots here have superstitious practices that keep them from getting sick. In fact, we were able to study this phenomenon in the late 19th, early 20th century when there was another plague outbreak in China. And epidemiologists found out that the people who were living there had the following superstitions. So folks who hunted marmots had rules that said that you cannot capture a live marmot. You have to shoot it. Okay, don't capture a live marmot or you will be plagued by bad luck. All right, so bad luck if you capture a live one. You're also supposed to avoid marmots that are moving slowly or sluggishly because they might be sick. And so those were considered untouchable marmots. Just skip over those, don't try to take their fur, leave them alone. And if you start to see marmots that are just dying off by the dozens, a whole colony starts to die off, you're supposed to pack up all of your stuff, get all your family members together, and move, get out, get away from this colony, because if you stay there, then bad spirits will follow you. And so these are ultimately superstitious practices because they're based on bad luck, they're based on bad spirits and things like that. But in actuality, it's connected to, of course, the plague, the bacteria, which they can't see at this time. And so these practices may very well have helped them avoid getting sick. So they avoided the plague, which now it makes you wonder, well, what happened? Why is it that in the 14th century, we suddenly see an outbreak? Well, it has a lot to do with the Mongols, all right? So the Mongols are heading into China at this time, and they don't really know much about the local customs, and they don't necessarily respect the local customs. And so you might see either Mongols or displaced Chinese refugees heading into new territory where they don't know the customs, and they see these adorable little marmots here, and they're well aware that their fur is valuable. And so they think, all right, well, I'm going to catch some marmots and either keep or sell their fur. And when they see a slow moving marmot, they think, well, that's a lot easier to catch, so might as well get that one. Or they might walk over and say, oh, this one's already dead, and just pick that one up and skin it. And so we can see how the plague might jump from these rodents here to the people who don't know to be concerned about it. All right, they don't understand that there's a problem here and that you should avoid these rodents at all cost. And so we start to see people coming down with this sort of mysterious illness at the time. And our Chinese sources are a little bit scant. So we do have some sources from China on the plague outbreak here, but usually the more detailed ones are from the Middle East and from Europe. But what we do know at this time is that sometime around 1331, there is a plague outbreak in the Hebei province in China. And the Chinese sources say that this illness that breaks out goes from town to town and kills 9 out of 10 people. Okay, 9 out of 10. Now, if you're thinking, ooh, that sounds like a lot. 9 out of 10? Are they sure about that? But the interesting thing about the Chinese sources saying 9 out of 10 is that it actually corroborates the European sources that also say 9 out of 10. And we're going to get to the discrepancy there between what the eyewitnesses are telling us and what we're trying to piece together based on material evidence and demographic studies and all of that. So we'll talk more about that later. But the Chinese sources are telling us that about 9 out of 10 people in these villages are dying from this mysterious illness. And we can shed a little bit of light on the Chinese numbers if we look at a series of censuses. So around 1200, there was a Chinese census that put the population at 123 million. So the year 1200, 123 million Chinese. And then there's another census that's done in China in 1393, and it puts the Chinese population at 65 million. Okay, so in this span of just under 2 centuries, the Chinese population has nearly been cut in half. And that is a very drastic decrease here. And it's really difficult to say whether it's entirely due to the plague or whether it's a variety of factors, because I had mentioned before that just having the Mongols spread throughout China is going to lead to lots and lots and lots of deaths and just destruction overall. I mentioned the quotas that these Mongol soldiers would have. So we know the Mongols probably killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Chinese folks here. So we know that they're to blame for some of this, but we're almost certain that the plague is to blame for the rest of it. All right, and so now. I had a question about the Mongols and the marmots. So that is based on the studies that were done by epidemiologists in the 19th century and seeing what Chinese refugees were doing. And there is evidence, though, that the Mongols were selling the pelts of marmots at the time. So we've kind of combined the evidence from the 19th and early 20th century with the fact that they were selling the pelts there and assumed that that's what's going on. So yeah, that's the best explanation that we can come up with for all of that. And so now, in addition to the issues that we have here with the population decreasing as a result of the Mongols, we have that same sort of phenomenon of war, famine, and plague. The Mongols bring in the war and to a certain extent bring in the famine as well. So sometimes famine is a result of accident, all right, that you're just burning some of the crops and things like that as you go along, or you're killing some people who are then not able to tend to their fields, which ends with a famine. But with the case of the Mongols, we also have instances of them deliberately destroying crops. So specifically in what is modern day Korea, we see them going in and deliberately forcing a famine, so destroying the crops and kind of paving the way for a more weakened population in Asia as well. And so we have that war and famine and plague phenomenon going on in China as well. And so let's see. Oh, and the picture to the left there. So that is a picture where allegedly the Chinese emperor is getting word of the spread of the plague. So getting word of the spread of an unknown virus there. So from representatives from across China coming from the Silk Road. So it's that moment where he's finding out what's going on. And so now I want to talk about the spread of the plague. So once it starts to get out of China. So one of the most populous countries that is closest to China is, of course, India. And so India is kind of a strange sort of outlier when it comes to the Black Death, because it seems like India would have been ripe for basically having a catastrophic number or a catastrophic death toll during the plague, because it is a high population state, even in the Middle Ages here. But surprisingly, India is mostly spared. So India is mostly spared from the plague, and historians still aren't totally sure why that is. So the prevailing idea is that some parts of India were hit by the plague, especially some of the port cities. And so these port cities were part of the Silk Road. So there's no way that they weren't hit by the plague. However, we think that that in India we have these sort of villages that are widely dispersed throughout India. It might take a couple of days of walking to get from one village to the next. So it's possible that the plague would break out in one of the port cities there, but it would kill people so quickly that they didn't have time to walk to the next sort of remote village. And so in that way, in India, the plague might have operated a little bit more like Ebola has operated in recent years, where Ebola tends to kill its host so fast that it's difficult to spread it from one village to the next because, well, you're dead before you can make that trip. And so it's possible that that's what happens in India at this time. So India is a little bit of an outlier. We also know that in India, that it's the only major state in the old world that experiences population growth in the 14th century. Every other major state in the old world experiences a population decline in the 14th century. So that could be further evidence that India was not as hard hit by the plague. And so we don't see it quite as much in India here. And and I had a question about the province that the plague had broken out in. So the province there is the Hopei province, as Hopei. So Hopei. And forgive me if I am not pronouncing that 100% correctly there. So I don't speak Chinese. But the plague starts to spread outside of China and starts spreading through the old Persian Empire. And this is where we have quite a bit more documentation on the spread. And fortunately for folks who are living in the Middle East at this time, the plague does not spread quite as quickly in dry air. Okay, so it doesn't spread quite as quickly there. And so we don't see the same death rate in the Middle East as we see in China and then later on in Europe. So our sources from the Middle East mentioned that the plague killed roughly maybe 30% of the population, which that's interesting that I can sit here and say, oh, well, it wasn't as bad in the Middle East there. It only killed 30% of the population. So that gives you some idea of just how horrible this plague was when you can say only 30% of the population. And so on the slide there, I have I have a quote there from Ibn al-Wardi, who was a Syrian historian who was writing on the plague, and he makes some guesses about where the plague might have come from. So when he says that the plague came from the land of darkness, what he means is Mongolia, or modern day Mongolia, that's where the plague was coming from, and that it then spread to China, and he thinks that it spread to India as well, and then eventually to the Caspian Sea and parts of Eastern Europe or former Soviet Union sort of areas, so Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, all of that, and then the Persian Empire and Mediterranean. So he does a really good job of tracking its spread all, from China and into the Middle East here. And we have a number of writings from him on the plague until he dies of it himself. So this is kind of a situation similar to what we see in the ancient world with Thucydides, for example, who was an eyewitness to the plague in Athens and comes down with it himself. So he is able to describe in detail all of the symptoms of this. And so we do see this from Middle Eastern chroniclers at the time, including Alwardi and a number of others as well. So they give us an idea of how it's spreading across the Middle East here. But now I want to talk a little bit. I had gotten a question about, did the Chinese have a better idea about plague origins than bad spirits or witches? Not at the time that we know of. Okay, so as I said, the Chinese sources are a little bit more sparse. And at least now, from everything that I have read, it's possible that there are more Chinese sources on the plague, but those sources are being censored. And so you can't get access to all of the sources on the plague at the time. And so it's hard to really say. But from everything that we can gather up to this point, it's mostly about bad spirits, essentially, which in Europe, we don't see much of anything any better than that. And so we'll be getting to a little bit of that momentarily here. And so now I want to discuss the spread of the plague into the eastern parts of Europe and into the Mediterranean, and all of the drama that goes on at Caffa. So you can think of Caffa as a port city on the Crimea. It's right along the coast of the Black Sea, and it's one of the most lucrative trading ports because it connects the east to the west. And at least at the time, it had kind of a world-renowned slave market. So it's a very strategic location here that everybody wants to have control of. So everybody wants Caffa, everyone wants control of the Crimea here. And throughout most of the Middle Ages, Caffa has changed hands, just one state after another. So early on, in the early 13th century, the Republic of Venice had control over Caffa, but then the Mongol Golden Horde ends up taking it over in the mid 13th century. So we go from Italians to Mongols, but then the Mongols sell it to the rivals of the Venetians, which are the Genoese. So it goes back into Italian hands. And the Genoese maintain control over Caffa until all hell breaks loose in the 1340s. Okay, so we're setting the scene here of it changing hands between Italians and Mongols, and there's this idea that the Mongols want it back. All right, the Mongols want it back, and they're going to do whatever they need to do to take Caffa back. And specifically, the leader of the Golden Horde, a man by the name of Genebek Khan, decides that he is going to bring Caffa back under Mongol possession. And so he teams up with Crimean Tatars and launches an attack against the Genoese in 1343. And he besieges the city, but the Genoese get relief from other Italian soldiers who come to their rescue, essentially. So his first siege of Caffa is a failure. So he's already lost once. So that means, like, if he's coming back, then it's just no holds bar. He's going to do whatever he needs to do in order to take this city here. So Genebek Khan comes back again in 1345 and between 1345 1346, and this time it looks like he's going to lose again. Not necessarily because of any strategical errors or anything like that, but he notices that his soldiers are dropping like flies. So they're getting sick, they're not able to fight. His numbers are just being decimated before they even get to the city walls there. So he recognizes, we're gonna lose this thing. So just going to do whatever I need to do to not lose. So he starts loading his soldiers' plague-ridden dead bodies into trebuchets, which is what you're seeing in the picture at the bottom there, just loading them into trebuchets and launching them over the walls at the Genoese. And so the Genoese inside the wall see these plague-ridden bodies raining down on top of them, and they just call it a day. They say, forget it, we don't even need this city, let's go back home immediately. And so we see this mass exodus of the Genoese from Caffa going back to Italy after having plague bodies rain down on top of them. And so you can imagine what kind of disaster this is going to lead to here. In fact, this instance at Caffa with Genebek Khan launching these plague-ridden bodies over the walls may very well be the first example of intentional biological warfare in history, because he 100% did it on purpose, and he did it to get the Genoese sick. And so we see plague breaking out among the Genoese there, and the Genoese heading back to Italy. And oftentimes this is seen as the moment when the plague enters into Europe. You hear of these really dramatic stories of ships coming into harbor, the rats scurrying down the ropes and all of that. And that's half true. All right. So that is half true. It kind of dramatizes the whole situation and makes it seem as though if this one thing had gone differently, then maybe, just maybe, Europe would have been spared, if only Genebek Khan hadn't done that. But in actuality, the plague was coming no matter what. And in fact, the thing that had more of an effect on the spread into Europe than, say, this instance at Caffa was just trade in general. All right. Rats were hitching rides in people's knapsacks and stuff, or in some cases, hitching rides on boats. And it was just business as usual, just instances of trade, spreading it all throughout the Mediterranean here. And so now to talk about the beginning of the apocalypse, or at least that's how people saw it at the time here, which you can see from this quote from Agnolo about how many people were dying, the fact that they're having to bury them in mass graves. They're seeing dogs dragging people's bodies out of the graves there, and that people get to the point where they can't even weep for the dead anymore. They're just that numb to it all because they're just waiting on their own demise. And as he says here, that so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. Okay, and so so having said that, I want to talk about how it enters into Europe and how quickly it spreads and some of the consequences of the spread into Europe. So after the plague hits Caffa, it then spreads into Constantinople and sometime in the spring of 1347, and then it spreads into Sicily at the port of Messina, and then spreads into Alexandria, Egypt. So you're noticing all of the port cities all around the Mediterranean are getting hit really, really hard by the plague. And so that same year, we start to see Majorca in Spain getting hit by the plague, Marseille in southern France, and every single trading city along the Italian coast gets hit by the plague. So Genoa, Pisa, Venice, the Amalfi Coast, all of those cities start to come down with the plague. And by 1348, we see it beginning to move inland. And so it quickly takes Italy, then France, then the Balkans. And by 1349 and 1350, the plague had hit almost every single state in Europe. There are only two exceptions to this rule. So Iceland and Finland are the only states that reported no deaths from the plague, and where we don't think anyone was affected. There are some isolated communities here and there in other states that just weren't affected by the plague, but as far as an entire country not being affected, Iceland and Finland are the only ones. And lots of historians have made guesses as to why that may have been. One of the guesses is that it's more difficult for the plague to spread the colder it is. So that could be a possibility here. The other guess is that Iceland in particular is isolated, being an island there, and that Finland in particular was sparsely inhabited. And so it might have been kind of an India situation where your villages are too far apart. And so it's unlikely for the plague to spread throughout the country as a result. And so, having said that, every other state in Europe ends up being affected by the plague. And even though death rates could vary from city to city, a very, very conservative estimate would have at least half to 2/3 of the European population dying. All right. And we're going to get to why it is that people say 1/3 a little bit later on, but it's somewhere between half and 2/3 of the population dying. And mind you, they've already experienced about 1/4 of the population dying during the Great Famine, just 25 years before all of that. And then they're right in the middle of the 100 Years' War as well, because that's raging at the time that the plague hits Europe. So we have a war, we have a famine, now we have a plague. And so it's no wonder that people who are living during this time assume it's the end of the world. It is the apocalypse. How could it possibly get any worse than all of this? And so unfortunately for them, they're fighting this disease blindfolded, essentially. They have no idea what's causing any of this, and we won't find out what causes all of this until the end of the 19th and early 20th century, because microscopes had to be invented. And so they can't even see what's attacking them, and it's really difficult to understand your enemy or to combat your enemy when you don't even know what it is. And so people just try their best to explain the plague and fight it as best they know how. And so we're going to get into some of the explanations of the plague and, why it started to begin with. So I want to start with this idea of religious explanations here. So when we look at these religious explanations, the idea is that God sees how sinful and depraved everyone is on earth, and he wants to punish people for all of their wrongdoing. And so there's this overall theme throughout the plague of divine disapproval, that God does not approve of your actions and he is going to do something about it. And this divine disapproval could manifest itself in a number of different capacities, because once people establish that the plague is caused because God is really ticked off at all of us because we're being so horrible, everyone starts to kind of survey their lives and they think, all right, well, what are we doing? What are we doing wrong here? What can we blame for all of this? And so one of the theories was that God thought that the church had become corrupt. Okay, that the church was the problem here, because it's true that throughout the Middle Ages, the church had become more and more and more decadent, for starters. So we see massive churches being built. We see archbishops with salaries that would make, I don't know, a king blush. And so we see more decadence within the church. We see a number of sexual indiscretions going on within the church as well. And there's the idea that God does not approve of all of this. So it could be a problem within the church. It could could also be a problem with medieval entertainment. That was one of the assumptions at the time, that God did not approve of all of the excesses that were associated with medieval fairs and medieval tournaments and things, all the violence that goes on, all of the overeating and drinking and dancing around to music, that God doesn't like that. And so he is smiting people with a plague. There was also an assumption that he sent down the plague because women dressed too risque, or because some men dressed like women. So that is an actual explanation or assumption there, that it was just the way that people dressed that God didn't approve of. Or one of my favorite ones here was that God sent down the plague because children were disobedient. All right, children were disobedient, and that parents didn't know how to discipline their children properly anymore, which I think is very interesting, because that tends to be a generational issue that it still exists to this day. You have one generation that assumes that the next generation isn't hard enough on their kids, and that all these kids misbehave as a result of that. And so in the Middle Ages, we hear of them saying things like, well, back in my day, when kids used to misbehave, we would stone them to death. And now people only beat their kids. Geez, no wonder these kids are acting up, which of course makes you think of folks nowadays there, where, I mean, I've heard my own father say things like, if I got in trouble at school, well, that was just the beginning of it. Wait until I get home and my dad's gonna tan my hide. And so, but then they see people nowadays who kind of eschew corporal punishment for their children, and they think, oh, these kids have gone soft. And so, yeah, in the Middle Ages, they thought the exact same thing, just perhaps taken to more of an extreme here, that just kids are misbehaving. So that's a huge problem as well. And then when you look at the slides here, you can see an example of this idea of divine disapproval, that that basically everyone needs to take stock of how evil they are, not only they themselves, but all of the people around them. And that and this is actually encouraging people to take up arms against all of the sinners around you. Do something about this so that God will be appeased and will lift the plague. And another thing that you might notice from the slide here is this emphasis on arrows and on Saint Sebastian. So that's who you're seeing in the two pictures there. So traditionally, going all the way back to the ancient world, people believed that plagues were came down from the skies. All right, plagues came down from the skies. The gods caused the plagues, and specifically in ancient Greece and Rome, they believed that the god Apollo, for example, caused plagues by shooting arrows down at people and infecting them. And so this idea of plagues coming from arrows being shot down from the sky kind of takes off like wildfire throughout the Middle Ages. And so if you think of arrows as causing the plague here, well, it makes sense that you would then be drawn to the saint who was martyred by being shot full of arrows, except he lived through the first martyrdom. So Saint Sebastian was shot by the Romans, just filled full of arrows, and managed to survive. And then after that, he was martyred again, and it was a little bit more successful there. But there was the idea that Saint Sebastian, he knew what to do. He had some sort of divine inspiration there and divine immunity. And if you prayed to Saint Sebastian, then you were much less likely to come down with the plague. So that's why we see tons of people full of arrows anytime we're looking at art in the middle of the plague. And so, so now, if we think that it is a divine, or it's divine retribution, then of course it makes sense to have a religious response to the plague, that it's somehow related to religion. And oh, and I saw a hand was raised. Did I have a question? Mm-hmm.
Yep, I'll go ahead. Stephen, would you like to ask a question?
Yes. So how about blaming the Jews?
Oh, we're going to get to that. So,
okay.
Yes, they absolutely blamed the Jews. And so we're going to be talking all about that either in this class or the next one. And yeah, and was there another question? And the hand raised?
And Roger, do you have a question?
Not I.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, well, we will continue on, and I'll also leave a couple of minutes at the end for some questions as well. So, so when we're looking at these religious explanations here, or religious responses, this idea that God was punishing mankind kind of took off like wildfire. And so the seemingly logical response to this was to say, well, if the plague is punishment from God, what if we take this into our own hands and we punish ourselves? And we punish ourselves so well that God looks down at us and says, wow, good job punishing yourselves. You guys have really done some excellent work here. I guess I can lift the plague now. So that is their logical explanation for this. And it leads to a whole movement called the flagellant movement. So these flagellants would go through from town to town, beating themselves and punishing themselves to atone for their sins and all of humanity's sins in an effort to get God to lift the plague. And so unfortunately, medieval people believed that the blood of the flagellants was magical, and that if you went out and you caught the blood of the flagellants on handkerchiefs as they were walking by, beating themselves bloody, and you kept that bloody handkerchief with you and close to you there, that you were less likely to get the plague, that the magical powers of the blood of the flagellants would protect you. And if you're sitting here thinking, oh no, medieval people, that is the worst thing you could possibly do. You're right, that's one of the worst things that they could possibly do, but they did it anyway. And I should also mention that the flagellant movement and people's response to the flagellants, that is another one of those bottom-up phenomenons. So we're talking about average, everyday people. The flagellant movement was not sanctioned by the church at all, not even a little bit. In fact, Pope Clement VI spoke out against it. He issued papal bulls, which are these official, we'll call it an official Pope document or announcement or letter, and he issues these official papal bulls against the flagellant movement and says that it's not supported in scripture and that it is not helpful, and in fact they are causing even more problems by doing all of this, so stop. And later on, the Pope even has to threaten the flagellants with excommunication, not only because they're going from town to town, beating themselves bloody and spreading the plague everywhere that they're going, but the flagellants also took this idea of punishing themselves or punishing humanity for their sins and expanded it to other people. So punish other people that you see as being sinful. And this could expand to, in some cases, religious minorities, among those religious minorities, Jews. So the flagellants were known for persecuting Jews along the way. And we'll be talking about that in more detail momentarily. But just note, it's not the Pope all right? It's not the church establishment that's encouraging this. It's everyday people who are doing all of this. And so when it comes to the church itself, this was a time when people needed the church more than they had ever needed them before in their entire lives. And when it comes to the church's response to the plague, it was a real mixed bag that could vary from parish to parish, from person to person. So there are some accounts of clergy members who take the plague head on, who are right in the thick of it, essentially in the trenches, fighting the plague, tending to the poor, saying prayers for the sick, or performing last rites or final unction on the dead there. And so there are some of them who really do live up to their positions and do the right thing. But there are also other clergy members who go in the opposite direction. In fact, we hear of some clergy members at, say, poor parishes out in the middle of the country deciding that they're going to abandon their parish there because it's full of poor people and go to a wealthier city where people will pay them to say prayers for them or pay them to do last rites. So just abandoning the poor completely. So it really just varies from person to person as to how they respond to this. And when it comes to the Pope himself, it depends on at what point in the plague we're talking about as to how effective the Pope was. Because early on in the plague, when they believed that it was being spread by miasma, that gas that wafts up from the fields, the way that you fought miasma was to burn it out. And so they would set bonfires to burn off the miasma in the air. And they didn't want the Pope to get sick. And so they put him in his palace there in Avignon and surrounded him with bonfires and just wouldn't let him leave. He just had to sit there in the middle of all of these bonfires, just sweltering and being bored all day, and then not looking so good, because while all of the people around him are suffering, dying from the plague, the Pope is nice and safe right in the middle of his palace. And that's just a bad look. And the Pope recognized this himself and eventually said, all right, you guys, we've got to put out the fires. Let me out of here. I've got to actually do something about this. And so this is when the Pope starts to work more towards protecting vulnerable communities from persecution. And he even goes out and consecrates the Rhine river. And he does this because they were starting to run out of holy ground to bury people on. And so he just consecrates the entire river there so that if people need to, they can just throw bodies into it. So he's doing what he can, or what he knows to do to combat the plague. And we also see church members trying to take on the roles of doctors. And that's what you can see in this quote here, which is kind of interesting because it's essentially a prescription. All right. What you're looking at right there is a prescription. So instead of going to a doctor, you might go to a priest, and the priest will prescribe you a dose of bitter loathing against sin committed by him and of true contrition of the heart, and tells you to mix these two with the water of tears and vomit naked and pure confession, purge the pestilential poison, all of that. And so it's interesting that they are taking on this role of doctor, and they firmly believe that this is effective. So from a modern perspective, we might read something like this and think, gosh, it almost looks like they're trolling the people here, trying to come up with prescriptions from the church here instead of actual medical prescriptions, but they firmly believed in what they were doing here. And so now I want to talk about, or the last little thing I want to talk about today, are some of the other human explanations for all of this. So if by some chance God isn't to blame for all of this, then what if people are to blame for it? And who is to blame for the plague. And more often than not, they tended to blame Jews for this. So just as a little background for that, anti-Semitism had been running rampant throughout Europe since about roughly the 11th century. In the early part of the Middle Ages, we don't really see as much anti-Semitism throughout Europe because populations are dispersed. They're mostly concentrating on subsistence farming, and nobody has time to be burning their neighbors at the stake during that period. But after about the year 1000, the economy starts to get better in Europe, and people have a little bit more time on their hands to concentrate on persecuting their neighbors. And so they tend to shift their focus towards persecution of Jews at this time, at least in part because of the commercial revolution. So in the commercial revolution of the year 1000, we start to see the formation of new classes in Europe. So artisan classes and merchant classes and a new type of economy. And this new type of economy necessitated the position of moneylender. And so this position was something that Christians could not fill because the Bible prohibits Christians from lending money with interest. It's considered usury, and it was considered to be a predatory practice. So we have an economy that needs money lenders, but Christians can't fill that niche. Now, when it comes to Jewish populations there, Jews could not take part in other aspects of the economy because they could not be craftsmen, because they were barred from joining guilds that openly discriminated against religious minorities. So if you're a Jew, your options are fairly limited at this time. So you often fall into the niche of money lending because it's one of the few things that is actually open to you. And so when it comes to money lending, this is it's a position that's necessary but hated at the same time. And so even today, when I don't know, we run up our credit cards, we made all of the purchases there, so it's our responsibility, but we still tend to hate the credit card company when they come to collect on that. And the same holds true for Jews in the Middle Ages there. People willingly took out loans from them, but then when they came to collect, it makes them into this sort of hated minority. So you have a hated position that's combined with a religious minority, which leads to stereotyping of that entire religious minority and leads to an uptick in anti-Semitism. And so by the time that we get to the 14th century, anti-Semitism is not only associated with the economy, but it's also associated with this concept of blood libel, which is what you're seeing in the top picture to the left. There's this idea that Jews like to go around and capture or kidnap Christian children and then bleed them out and then use their blood as salves and unguents and things like that at their Sabbaths. And some of this is stemming from not only the First Crusade, when Crusaders went through Europe and they saw that there were a number of Jews who were trying to avoid the Crusaders, who would come in and forcibly convert them or kill them or both. And they'd try to avoid this by sometimes killing their own children and then killing themselves. So it spreads this idea that Jews kill children. And instead of taking that within its context of them doing mercy killings of their own children, Christians later assumed that, oh no, they hunt down Christian children and kill them. And then that is combined with the new doctrine in Christian beliefs. Starting around 1215, they switch the rules essentially of transubstantiation, which is communion, the taking of the bread and the wine as the body and blood of Christ. They switched the rules for that in 1215. Originally, this was taken metaphorically. All right. But starting around 1215, they say, no, it's not a metaphor. When you consume the bread and the wine, it is literally the blood and the flesh of Christ. And this freaks people out. Okay. It freaks people out, and they think that they are being cannibals. But they don't really have any recourse there. They still have to continue taking communion because you can't really speak out against the church at this time, but they're really nervous about their new situation. So they tend to project that anxiety onto other groups, specifically onto Jews. And that's where that practice of blood libel comes in, where they assume that no, it's Jews who are the ones who are bleeding people out, maybe drinking blood or eating flesh or something like that. And it's all a result of anxieties that Christians themselves were having that were associated with new rules about communion. And so we see anti-Semitism all over Europe at this time, which makes Jews a really easy scapegoat for the plague. Okay, so you already have a minority that is despised by the majority, so it's easy to blame them for that. And so in the next presentation, we're going to be getting into how that manifests itself, how they were blaming the Jews, what they were blaming the Jews for doing, and what they did to Jews as a response to all of that. But for this presentation, I think we're running out of time here, and I want to save a minute or two to have some questions. So I'll end right there, and let's see, I can catch up with some of the questions in the chat there. And let's see, I will catch up on a few of these. And I had some questions there about resistance to the plague in India, and whether it had to do with their use of herbs and spices for internal medicine. And that might be a possibility, because we do know that certain herbs and spices like turmeric, for example, which is widely used in Indian cuisine, is something that can help bolster immunity. So it's possible. That is absolutely possible that it helped with immunity, and that it could have been combined with the fact that the population was a little bit spread out. So maybe they had multiple things going for them. So yes, that is possible. And I also had a question about, do all diseases commence using an animal as a host? Not necessarily. So there are some instances, of course, of diseases that are spread just person to person, of course, and bacteria that is spread from person to person that exists as its own little entity there and doesn't necessarily need an animal as a host. But it seems like some of the most virulent diseases that we have are the diseases that jump from an animal to a person there. And so I also had a question about survival rates. So in the next lecture, we're going to be getting into all of the symptoms of the plague, what your experience would be like if you came down with the plague, and how likely it was that you would survive the plague. So we will be getting to all of that. And then I also had a question about, let's see, do they distinguish the cause, the loss of half or 2/3 of the population from plague? So yes, we can actually distinguish to a certain extent the population decline that we see in Europe at this time, and distinguish it from, say, the 100 Years' War that's going on and the plague, because there is a pause in the 100 Years' War once the plague begins. Basically, both England and France take a time out in the middle of the plague because it's just that bad. And so any of the deaths that we see during the time out in the 100 Years' War, we can almost certainly attribute to the plague. And then as far as the flagellant movement is concerned, it's difficult to quantify exactly how much Europe was affected affected by the flagellant movement, but we know that it was widespread all throughout Europe at this time. So it's not necessarily confined to one specific state there. And we are pretty positive that the flagellants ended up spreading the plague as they moved from town to town to town, because we can actually track the death rate from one town to another and compare that with primary source documents that discuss the flagellants moving from one town to another. So we do know that they had an effect on the spread of the plague throughout Europe there. And so other questions there, let's see. And actually, you had mentioned something in the chat there about kosher or dietary rules, which we're going to talk a little bit about in the next class, because it's incredibly ironic that in this case, Christians are accusing Jews of drinking blood or eating flesh when kosher law prohibits all of that, and that it's actually a reflection of Christians' anxieties about the Eucharist there. So that's a good point. Yeah, we're definitely going to talk a little bit about kosher law, and we'll be talking a little bit about why it is that certain Jewish communities were less likely to either get the plague or they tended to experience a slightly lower death rate, which it seems like it would be beneficial, at least at first, until people from the outside notice that they are not dying at the same rate and they become suspicious of them because they're not dying at the same rate. And so let's see if I had a couple of other ones. So I had a question about why did the church make the change about transubstantiation there? And it's debatable as to why they suddenly made that change. But what we do know there is that with transubstantiation, it actually increased the power and the authority of priests. Because prior to this, if you think of the Eucharist as being just metaphorical, then in theory, anybody can just take the blood and or take rather the wine and the bread, and the assumption is that it's a metaphor. It's already there. You don't necessarily need some outside source to come in and change it into something. But with transubstantiation, you actually need to have a priest come in and say, hoc est corpus, so this is the body, and they have to do something to it in order to change that bread and wine into the blood and flesh of Christ. So you could make the argument that it's something that leads to great or increased authority on the part of the church, because you have to have that priest coming in and performing that sacrament or helping to perform that sacrament in order for it to be effective. And you didn't necessarily need that before. So that's a possibility as well. And I had some folks with their hands raised if you'd like to ask a couple of questions.
I enjoy your lecture again. I find it very interesting that during the Roman Empire, the Romans said the same thing about the Christians, that they're killing children and drinking their blood. And now they're saying it about the Jews. And today, QAnon is saying about the Democrats.
Oh, yes, that's interesting. That was something that that actually occurred to me recently with the spread of the ideas of QAnon, that it's so very similar to persecution in the Middle Ages, because oftentimes the propaganda that was associated with that persecution had something to do with, one, targeting children, and two, drinking blood or cannibalism. And
it's like the same thing with the Orthodox, with the Christians in the Roman Empire. Because nothing's worse than turning against children.
Yes, exactly. And you could make the argument, at least in the Middle Ages and the ancient world there, that it's their own anxieties about the infant mortality rate. So the infant mortality rate is through the roof during this time. And people don't know why. They don't know why their babies are dying. And of course they're upset by it. They want an explanation. And it's a lot more satisfying for people to be able to blame it on someone, some entity, have someone to point the finger at, someone to persecute, rather than just chalking it up to happenstance. And so they find groups of minorities in the Middle Ages and they just say, you're the one that did this. And so it's all their anxieties. And I guess we could make the argument now that we see some of these conspiracy theories taking root because of anxieties of turmoil going on at this time as well. So yeah, that's an interesting sort of correlation between the two. And so do I have some other questions as well? More hands raised?
In the 20th century, before World War I, there was a case in Russia of Mendel Bayless, who was accused of kidnapping a Christian child and using his blood to make matzah.
Yes, actually, that was something that I was going to mention. It's one of the, weirdly enough, one of the things that when we discuss medieval persecution, that my students, my 18-year-old students there, think is the most ridiculous to the point of almost being funny, this idea that people actually thought that Jews were going around and taking the blood of Christian children so that they could add it to their matzo ball soup.
Yeah.
So it seems ridiculous, but they genuinely believed it at the time. And we see similar instances of this in the Middle Ages with the trial of a little boy named Simon, Simon of Trent. And this little 2-year-old child was actually found drained of blood, just found dead, but it was eventually blamed on a Jewish family there. And they were forced to just keep giving up name after name after name of more and more Jews that were involved in this child's death. And originally, one of the first witnesses said that they had found the kid's body in the Jewish family's cellar. And after the trial commences and they've killed dozens of Jews, the same witness comes forth and says, actually, I found him in a ditch. Whoops. So yeah, we're seeing this all throughout the Middle Ages here. So it makes sense that it's combined with this time of turmoil with the Black Death, that they're starting to scapegoat people, particularly the Jews here. And so did I have some other questions as well?
Well, we're about 10 minutes over at this point, Stephanie.
Yeah.
So we need to wrap it up. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's a great presentation.
All right, thank you. And hopefully I will see everyone next week and we will finish things up.